The wind hit Hank's fire lookout tower like a freight train made of ice. Perched high on Sentinel Peak, the ancient wooden structure groaned and shuddered. Below, the vast expanse of the Black Pine National Forest churned under the onslaught of a late October blizzard. Early, mean, and dumping wet, heavy snow like God had ripped open a feather mattress. Inside Tower 7, the air smelled of damp wool, stale coffee, and the sharp tang of ozone crackling off the radio. Hank rubbed his tired eyes, the kerosene lantern casting long, dancing shadows on the peeling paint of the walls. 2 weeks into his late-season stint, and the solitude was starting to itch under his skin. Not loneliness, exactly. Hank preferred quiet. It was the waiting for a spark that wouldn't come until spring thaw, trapped up here by the sudden storm that had rolled in faster than the weather service predicted. He missed his old basset hound, Rufus, buried back home under the big oak, missed the weight of another person breathing nearby. Mostly, he missed feeling like the world outside these thin walls made sense. He reached for the old UHF radio, a relic from the 70s with chunky dials and a speaker grill stained brown by decades of coffee spills. "Dispatch, this is Sentinel 7. Hank checking in, over." Static hissed back at him, thick and white, like sand pouring through the speaker. He adjusted the squelch. "Dispatch, Sentinel 7. You copy? Over." More static. Then, a voice. Thin and stretched, buried deep within the noise. Hank. Cold. So cold." Hank frowned, leaning closer. "Dispatch, that you, Marv? Sounds like you got interference. Repeat. Over." The static swelled, swallowing the weak voice. Then, abruptly, it cleared. Not to silence, but to a low, rhythmic thumping, like a slow, heavy heartbeat. Thump, thump, thump. It resonated deep in Hank's chest bone. He jerked his hand back from the mic as if burned. "Hello? Who is this? Identify! Over!" His voice sounded tight, too loud in the small space. The heartbeat static pulsed. Then, cutting through it, a new sound. Scrape. 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 Like something heavy, something metallic, being dragged slowly across concrete, right outside the tower. Hank froze. His blood turned to slush in his veins. The stairs. The sound was coming from the metal stairs spiraling down the tower's central support. Nobody was supposed to be out here. Not in this. Not ever, really, without radioing ahead. He grabbed the heavy maglite from its hook, its weight a small comfort. The beam cut a shaky yellow cone through the lantern-lit gloom as he moved to the bolted trapdoor in the floor. The only entrance. Scrape. 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 Thump.
Closer now. On the landing just below the trap door, Hank's knuckles were white on the flashlight. "Hello?" he called out, his voice rough. "Identify yourself. This is Forest Service property." Silence. Utter, profound silence. Even the wind seemed to hold its breath. Then, the radio crackled back to life, not with static, but with a voice. It was flat, toneless, devoid of any human inflection, like words forced through a mouthful of gravel and broken glass. "Hank, let me in. It's cold." Every hair on Hank's body stood rigid. That wasn't Marv. That wasn't anyone he knew. The voice held no warmth, no urgency, just a dreadful, matter-of-fact statement. It echoed the fragmented words he'd heard earlier. "No way," Hank whispered, backing away from the trapdoor, his back hitting the cold wood of the map table. "You ain't coming in here. State your business and get off this mountain." The silence stretched, thick and suffocating. Then, the scraping started again, not on the stairs now, on the underside of the trapdoor. Slow, deliberate strokes of something hard against the weathered wood. Scritch, scritch, scritch. Hank raised the maglite like a club, his breath coming in short, sharp gasps that fogged the cold air. The kerosene lantern flickered violently, casting the leaping shadows into grotesque, dancing shapes on the walls. For a terrifying second, the light dimmed almost to nothing, plunging the tower into near darkness, filled only by the relentless scratching and the oppressive silence from the radio. As the lantern flared back up, Hank saw it. Through the narrow gap where the trapdoor met the frame, where the old wood had warped slightly over the years. Not fingers, not anything recognizably human. It was a shifting mass of darkness, but not empty darkness. It was textured, like television static rendered solid, a seething, grainy, black and white and gray, constantly dissolving and reforming. And within that impossible texture, something long and thin, like a twisted antenna made of the same crawling static, probed slowly into the gap, scratching deliberately against the wood. A wave of nausea hit Hank, accompanied by a smell that cut through the damp wool and coffee. Ozone, sharp and electric, like after a lightning strike, but underneath it something else, something deeply wrong. The dry, papery decay of old decay, and the greasy reek of burnt hair and the cloying sweetness of spoiled fruit, all rolled into one stomach-turning miasma.
He stumbled back, tripping over his own cot, the maglite clattering to the floor, its beam rolling crazily across the ceiling. The scratching stopped. The static antenna withdrew from the gap. The silence returned, heavier than before. The radio crackled, that flat, horrible voice cutting through the quiet. "Hank, I smell your fear, like rust, like copper pennies." Panic, pure and icy, seized him. He scrambled for the flashlight, fumbling it, finally grabbing it and pointing the beam back at the trapdoor. Nothing. Just the worn wood. He pressed his ear against it. Nothing but the howl of the wind outside, sounding suddenly distant, muffled. Had he imagined it? Stress? Isolation? The rotten stew he'd eaten for dinner? He forced a shaky breath, trying to laugh it off. "Get a grip, old man," he muttered, rubbing his face. He needed coffee. Strong coffee. He turned towards the small propane stove, his back to the trapdoor. He filled the dented percolator from the water jug, his hands trembling. As he set it on the burner and clicked the igniter, a tiny spark jumped. Zzz. The sound came from behind him. Not loud, like a frayed wire shorting. Hank whirled around. It stood in the corner, near the radio desk, where nothing had been a second ago. The Static Man. It was roughly man-shaped, but only in the way a scarecrow built by a madman might be. 7 feet tall, maybe more. Its form composed entirely of that same seething, grainy static, a living, writhing sculpture of visual noise. No features, just a suggestion of a head atop impossibly long, thin limbs that ended in points, not hands or feet. It emitted no light. It seemed to drink the light around it, making the corner it occupied unnaturally dark. The air around it hummed with a low subsonic vibration Hank felt in his teeth. The stench, ozone, decay, burnt sweetness, intensified, thick enough to taste. Hank froze. His brain screamed, but his body refused to obey. The mag light felt like lead in his hand. The static man didn't move. It simply was, a monument of impossible wrongness in his tiny, cluttered world.
The radio on the desk behind the figure crackled, a burst of pure white noise. Then that flat voice emanated, not from the speaker, but seemingly from the static figure itself, vibrating the very air. "Cold outside, Hank. Warm in here. You have warmth." Hank found his voice, a dry croak. What are you?" The static head seemed to shift, the patterns swirling faster. "Signal. Lost signal. Found your wire." One long, staticky limb unfolded with impossible, jerky smoothness, pointing a needle-like tip at the radio. "Sang to me. Sang of quiet. Sang of alone." Understanding, cold and terrible, dawned on Hank. The radio, the weak signal, the strange interference he'd dismissed. It hadn't been malfunctioning. It had been a beacon, a dinner bell. "Tasted your fear," the voice continued, a monotone devoid of malice, only a terrifying hunger. "Tasty static, better than cold." Hank's survival instinct finally kicked in. He wasn't dying up here, not to this thing. He lunged, not for the trap door, but for the heavy fire axe mounted on the wall beside the cot. His fingers closed around the worn wooden handle just as the static man moved. It didn't walk, it flickered. 1 second it was in the corner, the next it was directly in front of him, filling his vision with its seething, silent chaos. The smell was overwhelming, making his eyes water. A limb, cold as deep space and humming with that awful vibration, lashed out like a whip. It didn't hit him. It passed through the raised head of the axe he was bringing up. There was no impact, only an instant of soul-rending cold, a sensation of his very molecules being violently scrambled, and a burst of blinding white static behind his eyes. He screamed, a raw sound torn from his throat, and staggered back, dropping the axe. It clattered harmlessly on the floorboards. Where the static limb had passed through the axe head, the metal was pitted with a perfect, smoking hole, the edges shimmering with residual static before cooling to blackened, brittle ruin, like it had been instantly, unnaturally corroded. "No sharp things, Hank. Sharp things cut the signal, make noise." Hank backed towards the bolted trapdoor, desperation clawing at his throat. The thing flickered again, reappearing between him and the axe. It was hurting him, towards the corner, towards the radio. "Sing again," it demanded, the static of its form swirling faster, agitated. "Sing the quiet song, the alone song." It gestured with a limb towards the microphone. "Make tasty static for me." The percolator on the stove began to whistle, a shrill, desperate sound piercing the oppressive hum. The static man's head snapped towards the noise, the static flaring like an angry swarm of bees. "Noise!" the voice boomed, vibrating the entire tower, making the lantern flame gutter wildly. "Bad signal!" It flickered towards the stove. Hank saw his chance. He didn't think. He dove for the trapdoor, fingers scrabbling at the heavy iron bolt. It was stiff, frozen with cold and disuse. He heaved with all his strength, muscles screaming. It gave an inch. Another. Behind him, the whistling stopped abruptly, replaced with a sizzling crackle and the smell of melting plastic and burning coffee. He risked a glance back. The static man stood over the ruined stove, the percolator a melted, sparking ruin in its grip. Tendrils of static were flowing from its form into the appliance, devouring it, reducing it to slag and shimmering ash that fell through its insubstantial limbs. Its head slowly turned back towards Hank. The swirling static seemed darker, angrier. "You make noise, Hank," it flickered, appearing right beside him. The cold radiating from it was intense, leaching the warmth from his bones. A limb, not pointed now but broad and flat like a static paddle, swept towards him. Hank threw himself sideways, crashing into the map table, sending papers and pencils flying. The static limb passed through the space where he'd been, hitting the thick wooden leg of the table. With the sound like tearing paper amplified 1,000 times, the solid timber dissolved into a shower of coarse, gray-black static dust that hung in the air for a second before vanishing. Hank scrambled backwards on his hands and knees, his breath coming in ragged sobs. There was nowhere to go. The thing was learning, adapting. It blocked the path to the axe, to the door. The windows were small, high, and thick with ice. Jumping meant a 200-foot drop onto jagged rocks.
The static man loomed over him, its form filling the cramped space. The hum deepened, becoming a physical pressure in his ears, in his skull. The stench was unbearable. It reached down with a limb that began to flatten and spread like static smoke aiming to engulf him. "Quiet now, Hank," the voice droned, devoid of triumph, only a terrible, final certainty. "Make good static, warm static." As the shifting darkness descended, Hank did the only thing he could think of. He screamed. Not in terror, but in pure, raw defiance. He screamed for Rufus, for the sun, for the life he'd left behind, pouring every ounce of his fading warmth, his desperate, messy humanity into that single, deafening sound. "No!" The static man recoiled, its form momentarily fragmenting, the static flaring chaotic and bright. The voice shrieked, a distorted feedback howl that shattered the lantern globe and blew out the radio speaker in a shower of sparks. "Too loud! Bad signal! No static!" The spreading limb pulled back, coalescing. Hank saw his opening. Not the trap door. The axe was useless. But the shattered lantern. Kerosene pooled on the floorboards, glistening in the dim light filtering through the windows. He lunged, not away, but towards the static man, towards the spreading pool of fuel. He ripped off his thick flannel shirt, ignoring the biting cold, and threw it onto the kerosene. Then, with a final gasping breath, he grabbed the smoldering, broken wick assembly from the shattered lantern and plunged it into the soaked fabric. Whoosh! Flames erupted, hungry and orange, leaping towards the ceiling. Heat blasted Hank's face. The static man shrieked again, a sound like tearing metal and screaming electrons. It flickered violently, its form destabilizing, the static dissolving into frantic, incoherent patterns. Firelight reflected in its impossible non-surface, making the shifting grays and blacks boil furiously. "Hot, bright, bad signal," it wailed, its voice breaking up, digitized. It flickered towards the trap door, its form shrinking, becoming less defined, more like agitated smoke than solid static. Hank rolled away from the flames, puffing, shivering uncontrollably despite the lingering heat. He saw the bolt on the trap door. The static man, diminished, writhing in apparent agony from the light and heat, flowed like oily smoke through the cracks around the trap door, vanishing downwards. Silence. Only the crackle of the flames eating at his shirt and licking up the floorboards. Hank scrambled back, grabbing a blanket, beating frantically at the fire. It took precious minutes to smother it, leaving a charred, smoldering hole in the floor and the tower thick with acrid smoke. He slumped against the wall, coughing, shivering uncontrollably despite the lingering heat. The radio was dead, a melted ruin. The stove was slag, the axe head was corroded junk, the trapdoor was still bolted shut. He listened, straining his ears over the roar of the wind and the frantic pounding of his own heart. Nothing. No scraping, no heartbeat static, just the storm. Had he won? Driven it off? Hope, fragile and cold, flickered in his chest. He crawled to the small, high window, wiping away a patch of frost with a trembling hand. He peered down into the swirling white maelstrom below. At first he saw nothing but snow and darkness, then movement, a shape darker than the storm. It stood at the base of the tower, looking impossibly tall even from this height. It wasn't flickering now, it was coalescing, the static becoming denser, more defined, feeding on the storm's fury, on the darkness itself. It raised its featureless head. Hank couldn't see eyes, but he felt its gaze lock onto him through the glass, through the blizzard.
The radio, though melted and silent, suddenly emitted a single, piercing burst of static, sharp as a knife. Then, inside his own head, cutting through the wind and his own ragged breathing, Hank heard it. That flat, toneless voice, clearer than it had ever been, resonating within the bone of his skull. "Still cold, Hank, still outside. Your wire broke, but I found another wire, quieter, warmer, inside." The static man below didn't move. It simply stood, a monument of hungry silence in the storm. Hank understood with a dread colder than the mountain peak. It wasn't gone. It was waiting, patient. The tower was wood, old, dry wood, and the fire he'd started, the charred hole in the floor, it was a weakness, a way in. It didn't need the door anymore. The voice echoed inside him again, a dreadful comfort. "No more static, Hank. Just quiet. Soon." Hank slid down the wall, his back against the cold wood, staring at the bolted trapdoor that was no longer a barrier, only a delay. The wind howled, a mournful counterpoint to the terrible silence radiating from the thing below. The storm raged on, but inside Tower 7, the real blizzard had just begun. It wasn't made of snow. It was made of static and cold, and a hunger that had finally found its warm, quiet meal. He pulled his knees to his chest, the smell of smoke and ozone clinging to him, and waited for the inevitable scrape against the weakened floorboards beneath him. The fire hadn't driven the static man away. It had just shown him a better way in. The quiet was coming, and it would be absolute.